Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest, Andre Edwards, and he's here to share with us his new book, Renewal: How Nature Awakens Our Creativity, Compassion, and Joy. Now, Andre is an educator, award-winning author, media designer, and sustainability coach. He's the founder and president of EduTrucks, a firm specializing in developing education programs and consulting services on sustainable practices for green buildings and business initiatives. So let's welcome to the show, Andre Edwards.
Great to be here, Marianne.
What an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this book. I could not wait to have this discussion with you. And I've got to ask, what has inspired you to write this book?
Well, my previous books had dealt a lot with sustainability topics. My first one dealt with the principles and the values of the sustainability movement. Then I went on and wrote another one that talked about the people and the organizations doing the work in sustainability. And then I wrote another book called The Heart of Sustainability that dealt with the personal side of sustainability. How do we rejuvenate ourselves? And I realized that underneath it all is nature. That's really the seedbed for all of these issues related to the sustainability movement, and really such an integral part of our lives. So I started looking into just researching what it is about being in nature. And then I started looking at how we use nature in design and how we use nature in our buildings and all these different areas. And that's sort of how the book came about.
Well, it's so interesting, while nature kind of really brings us back, to center and to a level of groundedness in many ways. So many people are so disconnected from nature.
Yeah, I think at least we live such fast-paced lives that are so technological. We're indoors 90% of the time. Most of the world's population lives in more urban areas and rural areas now. And so because of that, we are quite disconnected, and we go through our day-to-days. We sit in traffic, we sit inside in offices. And I think of it in terms of, we make time to do exercise, and it's equally important as much as we can to make time to be outside and to be in nature.
Mm-hmm. I know exactly what you mean. I know some people in West Hollywood, some friends of mine, and they're in that concrete jungle, where you're not really getting a whole lot of green.
Right, and I talk about all of the benefits, ranging from lowering blood pressure to being more creative to reducing stress to obviously you get vitamin D from the sun and improving your distance vision and lowers your risk of cancer by boosting your immunity. There's all this research that's coming out now from neuroscientists that are doing these studies, and it's sort of a new frontier. And so that was part of I was really, really interested in learning more about that and the tests that have been done with people. Put away the technology and get out and go for a camping trip for 2 or 3 days. See what happens after the first or second or third days. Or just simply take a 30-minute walk and they've done a study at Stanford where they had the group do a walk in a more urban, busy street, and they had another group do a walk in a more campus where there's more woods, and they discovered that they got even more benefits from the people who were just away from the traffic, away from the noise, away from the hustle and bustle of a downtown area. So these are the sorts of studies that are being done. There was another really interesting study at UC Berkeley where they had a group of students look at a building, just look at a concrete building, and another group that was reveling in a eucalyptus grove. And then they had a person walk through the woods and accidentally, quote unquote, drop the pen. And they noticed that the people that had been in nature were much more apt to be kind and to go and help them out. So it does something internally for us to be in nature. We'll become more open, we become kinder, and just more proactive to help others. So it's really fascinating to read all this stuff. And there are many theories as to why, and we can get into that, but it's just really interesting, all these studies that are coming out now about this.
Well, I would love for you to expand on that a little bit, because I think people, while they understand we've got benefits as in being in nature and having nature around us, sometimes they really don't understand the sciences behind it.
Well, there's a couple theories. One is the psychoevolutionary theory, which goes back to biophilia. And biophilia is a theory that says that we have an innate connection with nature that goes back to our ancestors. It goes back to the African days when we roamed the savannas. And that is just ingrained in who we are as humans. And that's partly why we just feel so connected and at home when we're in nature. It's just part of who we are. It's been around us for millennia. There's another theory called the attention restoration theory, which says it's really about how our brain works, because there are two types of attention. There's directed attention and undirected attention. And directed attention happens when we're focusing on something that's really intensely requires all of our focus. For example, dealing with a math problem or reading something where we have to be laser focused in capturing the attention. So it's completely undivided attention. And oftentimes after we do that, or even working on something mechanical could be that too, when we're done with that, we feel fatigued and drained. Our brain is just tired from all of that. And oftentimes when we're looking at a screen or doing our work, that's where our brain goes. It gets fatigued and tired. But in undirected attention, for example, when we're out in nature, we're not trying to solve a math problem per se, but we're out there just observing the patterns and the colors. Maybe it's looking at a meadow or enjoying a sunset. So we're not problem solving. And this reduces our stress and anxiety. And this is another way in which our brain relaxes by just taking it all in. And I've noticed that myself. You know, our minds can go many places when we're in nature, but if we really just focus on our senses and just for a moment take a break and say, okay, I'm just going to feel the wind against my body right now, or I'm just going to focus on looking at something, you know, just one specific area and seeing what happens, or looking how the branches are moving, or seeing the clouds move, or touching the texture of a bark, or whatever it is, it relaxes us because we're not trying to solve a specific problem.
Yeah, I love those moments where I could just sit and watch nature. And it really does allow you to escape and have the mind just kind of, I don't want to say check out, but just come to a peaceful place.
It's a peaceful place that allows our brain to recover and our bodies to recover, because we're all of a sudden we're not stressed out trying to solve a particular thing. We're just out there. And oftentimes I think about, okay, you know, I could go out on a walk and be thinking about a specific problem that I'm dealing with or something, and I might as well not have been out there because my brain is just so somewhere else. But if I then take away that and just shelve that and just say, I'm just going to be as present as I can in this walk or in this place, even sit down for a moment. And, you know, at the end of each of the chapters of the book, I have exercises and questions for people to ask themselves. And maybe I write on a journal for half an hour, or maybe I just sit in one spot and just observe from that one spot what happens for the next 10, 15, or 20 minutes, and just record it. Just take it in as an exercise to just be more present with what's around me.
Mm. Those are such great exercises because it really does require that people detach from their devices.
Yeah, and you know, I've thought a lot about devices, and it's easy to be so disconnected with the device. On the other hand, if you have an iPhone or something and you want to be able to identify a particular plant species, why not? You know, it's just like having a field book there. Or if you're interested in looking at the starry night and being able to look at the constellations, and you have an app that helps you with that, I think it's okay. It's just sort of how do we put limits on and being very conscious of how we use the technology when we're out there. Frankly, I feel just being without it is a really good way to be, because there's enough out there that we can take in when we're there. But there's other ways of incorporating technology. So I'm open to thinking about that and incorporating that, but just being really conscious of how we use it, how much we use it.
Yeah, just have that, just kind of think about that because it's easy to get kind of sidetracked with the emails that come in or the phone calls.
Well, that's it. That's the thing. So maybe it's better not to bring it at all, because one thing leads to the next, leads to the next. And I think I've noticed, Marianne, that even sound has a big impact. If we're able to just be in a more quiet place where we hear more natural sounds, where we're not hearing traffic or we're not hearing horns or the fire truck or whatever it is, has a huge impact in just calming us down. And oftentimes, if we're able to get away and just be in a place that is more secluded, more quiet, it has a huge impact. That's why in so many of the larger cities, the green spaces are so treasured. You know, just because it gives people an opportunity to get away from the urbanity and be in a place where they can just sit. So either Central Park in New York, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, other parks in major cities. And some cities are promoting a lot of green spaces, or as much as possible. And they've done studies in England where even the biodiversity, the more types of species of plants that you have in a green space, the better it is for us, rather than just having a green lawn. And somehow that makes us feel even more relaxed and more at home and less stressed.
Well, as a previous dog owner, I know how important it is having those green spaces. And I love getting out and doing those walks and being able to have parks and just these open spaces nearby. Because you're right, it does give you this sense of being able to relax and really get centered.
Yeah, yeah, and it could be a walk with a dog. It could be just exercise. That's one of the other things I sort of explored was what are the gateways that we use to be in nature, and it kind of a lot of it depends on who we are as individuals and what attracts us. So maybe it's an intellectual thing where we get really interested in the science of how this particular plant species or animal species works and how nature works and how cycles work, kind of more the scientific approach. Excuse me. Or maybe it's just recreation and we just want to be out there because we like to go running, or we like to go walking, or we like to go kayaking or rafting or climbing or camping or whatever it is we do. Maybe our entry is because of social justice and we really want to fight for a particular cause or some injustice that we feel. Maybe it's a spiritual experience for us that we want to be out there and commune in that way. Or maybe it's a creative expression when we feel like, like people want to create an art piece using natural materials. So there's many ways. And for many of us, I talk about how usually it starts in childhood where we spent times out in the woods, whether it was in a lake, swimming in a lake, or whether we had an experience fishing, or whether we had an experience camping. And maybe that one moment captivated us and stayed with us. And that may have been the key to our connection with nature. For some people, it starts early. For other people, it starts later. But for many people, it's a childhood experience that was just phenomenal that we still remember, or we long back to the summers we used to spend in such and such a place. And we always sort of remember that. And that brings us back to that particular way of being.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your book, you talk about awe and beauty. What are some examples of that, and why is that important?
Yeah, I have a chapter on awe and beauty, and there's some recent research that's going on what happens when we experience awe. And awe we can experience in many ways. It could be in nature, it could be a athletic feat, it could be a musical performance. But I focus more on awe in nature, and it's a really interesting thing that happens in our brains. And that is the first instant when we're awed by something. Let's say it's a sunset or a starry night or something. We have what's called perceived vastness, which is this feeling that we can't quite put it in context, and we feel like we're so small and there's something so much vaster happening around us. And so the brain is sort of trying to figure out what's going on. This is so amazing that I can't quite put it, I can't quite frame it. And then there's a period called accommodation, which is we begin to try and integrate it into something that makes sense for us. Now, these things could happen in split seconds, but it's that first stage when we're just like, oh, we're so odd. We're looking at the Grand Canyon and we see the vastness of the canyon and we feel so minuscule compared to it. We're just taking it all in. And there may be an element of fear, of surprise. We just don't know what's happening. And then quickly, our brain says, okay, yes, it's the Grand Canyon. It's just geologic, and I'm on the rim, and I'm safe here, and this is what I'm looking at. And so there's research being done with that. Also, they've done research with students in rafting experience and trying to measure their hormone changes in terms of rafting, how they get rushed and how they get excited when they're doing the rafting, and what that does to their bodies physiologically and emotionally. So it's a really fascinating thing. In terms of beauty, there's tons been written on beauty. It goes back to the Greek days and before, I'm sure. The thing about beauty that struck me was to look at beauty in terms of an indicator for the integrity of the ecosystem. So Aldo Leopold, a very famous environmentalist, had a quote that sort of speaks to this, to say that when an ecosystem is vibrant and is sound and is healthy, it's beautiful. And we see that beauty in it. When it's not, if we can think of pollution or mountaintop removal or clear cutting of a forest, obviously the beauty has been decimated there. We notice that as an indicator for that, the beauty's been taken away and it's not a healthy ecosystem. So maybe much like keystone species, there's certain species and ecosystems that can be indicators for the health and the food chain of the vitality of a system. Maybe beauty serves as that as well. And maybe that's the best indicator. And I also mentioned my book, Doug Tompkins is an environmentalist who unfortunately passed a few years ago. And he had a quote where he says, something along the lines of, if anything is going to save the environment, I'd put my money on beauty, because it's something that we all really cherish. And I think he's right in that it is such a powerful element for us to be able to protect an ecosystem. When we're so drawn to that, it probably goes back to the biophilia that I mentioned earlier, that it's a really, really good indicator to see what draws us to a particular environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love the perspective that you bring on that, because it makes sense. You look at this and you think about the Grand Canyon, and it does inspire awe and beauty at the same time. And it's just such a magnificent place. Of course, we would want to take care of it and make sure that it sustains.
Yeah, and it's something that, I think a lot of this has to do with who we are, where we are in our lives. I remember taking my kids to the Grand Canyon, and after a few minutes, I'd say, "Okay, Dad, it's a big hole. Can we go now?" And so it sort of happens. They were probably 7 or 8 or whatever. And I thought, okay, and there I was observing it. No, let's check it out. So kids have, it's just different at different ages, but also at different, depending on where we are in our lives. I think we're sort of more open to that than in other times, and even sort of how we're feeling that day too. So there's so many factors that are involved.
Yeah, without a doubt. That's hysterical though, but I think a lot of kids would probably do that until they get a little bit older and then can really appreciate what it is as a just kind of, a natural monument in some ways.
Yeah, and we didn't even hike down. I had the opportunity to actually hike down to the river one time, and that would have been torture for them maybe, but just the fact of just admiring the beauty of what's there, and I my bias is I start thinking about the geology and the history and all of the stuff that's gone on there, but people may have other tastes, but it also reminds me of when we look at a place in nature, how to look at it holistically and how to think of it as having its own character. And this is something that my colleague Bill Reed talks about as well, is to think of a place, and we can look at the geography and the biology of it and the geology of it in terms of, the plants and the wildlife and the history of the land and all that. But together with that is also the history of the humans, right? The human settlement. And what gives a place its character is not just the biology of it, but it's also the history of the human settlements there. And each place has its own character. So when we're going to, for example, do a development or change it in some way, it's really important to be able to get that history and that character from the locals. And maybe the only way that I can think of is to just sit down and have interviews and conversation with people at their kitchen tables and say, well, maybe you've lived here 40, 50 years. Tell me about this place. What drew you here? What do you find unique about it? And the more we're able to understand the character of a place, most likely the better job we'll do in whatever changes we'll make to that place. And I'm thinking here in terms of building or the built environment. But it could also be agriculture, whatever it is, to understand not just the present, but look at the past of what this place was. What was this valley before? What was it 50, 100, 500, 1,000 years ago? How did the mountains change? How did the first settlers come? What drew them here? What was their livelihood? All of that comes up and paints the character of the place.
Mm. Yeah, I know books are always such a journey. How has your perspective changed since writing this book?
Well, I'm excited about the research. I think that, there's there's a lot of research going on the brain right now, and some of it is connected to the brain and being in nature. So I was really fascinated by that bridge. There's also a lot of work being done in personal growth. There's so many programs, and so this is another. It's almost like a lab for you to be out in nature with that. So the more I looked into this book, the more I realized that there's so many facets to it, and that's why this book, is 8 chapters, and we talk about so many aspects of it, including what I talk about the eco ethic, which is something where we can look at nature in terms of what it provides us, and it's what we get from it, right? Almost like a resource. We just take this, it makes us healthy, it helps us in so many different ways. But I think it's also important to think about in terms of what we give back. How do we make it a reciprocal relationship? And that's when I dive into the ecological ethic aspect of it. We say, well, we can give back in terms of when we think about use of energy. Let's look at how we can give back through renewable energy, not just for our own needs, but for the community's needs. When we think back of restoring an area, whether it's been polluted or damaged in some way, how do we regenerate it so that it's maybe perhaps more biodiverse than it was before? So these are different ways that we can think of our relationship with the natural world. And I think that the more that we can understand that we are an integral part of it all, and we need to figure out what our place is and how do we live in balance with it, the better off we'll and natural systems will be, because we're very dependent. We're dependent for our own survival on the living systems of the earth. And then the next step is to say, well, we need to live here as well. So how can we do it in a better way, in a more thriving, sustainable way?
Yeah, 'cause I think a lot of people are concerned about the footprint that we leave behind, because when we look at just what's happening to our planet, to nature, our surroundings, a lot of people are very concerned about how we're leaving it, not just for us now, but for future generations.
Yeah, there's so much that is very disheartening and very bleak. And I do think that things are going to be very, very difficult. We're seeing it already with climate change, with the fires, with the immigration issues, with all the resources that are being pushed to their limits. And one of the difficult things about that is that the feedback loops, in other words, the full effect of it, is hard to connect the dots because they take years, sometimes decades. The CO2 and the pollution we're putting into the atmosphere now, the full effect of that in climate change is not going to be apparent for another 10, 20, 30 years. And even if we stop today, that's still in the air and is settling there. So how to make that connection? And I go back to just the importance of what we can do locally. So what we do in our own lives, with our families, with our friends, and in our communities, and because that's where we have the most direct impact and connection to it. So maybe it begins with just learning more about our own town and seeing, where do we get our energy for our community? Where do we get our water for our home? Where does most of our food come? Is there food that's grown nearby? And just to begin to understand the landscape of how we integrate those resources into our lives. And then from there we can move on, depending on our interests, join maybe a local group. And if there isn't a local group working on an issue that's of concern to us, maybe we start it. Or maybe we host like a bag lunch and talk about it. So there's just so many different ways to get integrated.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about getting people motivated and taking action. There seems to be a rise in that. But for those that might be new to this topic, you've listed a couple things already. What are some other ways that maybe they can start really feeling like, hey, I can get passionate about this?
I think the first thing is to identify our passion and to figure out what is it that motivates us, what is it that gives us juice, what is it that really makes us passionate about a particular topic. So maybe it's art, maybe it's a particular issue related to climate change. Maybe it's something related to agriculture and food. Maybe it's related to green building. Maybe it's related to fisheries, to timber harvesting, whatever it is. I list a whole lot of resources at the end of my book in terms of websites and books that relate to that. But I think the best thing is to first identify what moves us, what makes us, what sparks us, and then see what there is locally or regionally in wherever we live, and then start that way. And if there isn't, then in particular it's not happening, then that the way is to just get together with some friends and come up with something that you can do to mobilize and take action. When colleges and universities were first starting to try and figure out how to incorporate sustainability into the curriculum, everyone was trying to figure it out. And so what some of the administrations did in these universities was to just provide a small budget for teachers to be able to take each other out to lunch. So you would get the art teacher going out with the biology teacher, or the history teacher going out with the philosophy teacher. And as a way for them to start to bounce ideas on how this theme of sustainability, which sort of crosses all the disciplines and all the subtopic areas, how they could come up with really ingenious ways of developing courses around that. And it worked. Many schools, and then there was a group and an association that got together and invited some of these folks to come and then have a meeting or a conference about it, and it sort of grew from there. But the seeds of it were just a basic conversation over lunch, and so many of the things in our workplaces or in our local communities begin by just one person saying, well, what do you think about this? Then inviting other people, and then it sort of spawns from there and takes on a life of its own.
Well, it seems that that's something we really need to get more involved in and do, is kind of looking at this through a different lens, how we can come up with solutions to some of the problems we're having in regards to our environment.
Yeah. And, I think it's also important to look at what's already out there in terms of solutions, because there's a lot of, maybe not in the mainstream press per se, but in a lot of other journals and online sources, of some very, very encouraging and positive news of work that's going on at the community level that's having an impact. And I also think it's important to make sure that we read that as well. Make sure that we, at least for myself, I'll speak for myself, and then I try to also read some of the positive news that's going on in the world, and because it gives me inspiration to say, oh, this is a really cool new discovery. Oh, they're working on a new solar array, or oh, this person developed this new app that does this work or that work. So by being able to limit, because often the mainstream news can be quite disheartening and quite negative, and you say not to ignore it, but just to keep it within perspective, because there's also some really, really positive news and good solutions that are being tested out.
Well, I think we can all use some good news, right? Especially when it comes in regards to the environment. Gosh, Andres, I can talk with you forever. Your book, Renewal, is such a great resource. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community?
Well, I have a website. It's www.andresedwards.com. That's probably the best place to reach me through that. I'm giving some book talks locally here in the Bay Area, but probably the best way is through my website.
You can go there. Well, Andres, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Great, Marianne. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you, Andre. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you, and of course to talk about your new book, Renewal. Renewal is available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie bookstores. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.